0032 hours, April 29, 2022, a massive Chinese fleet made up of several dozen destroyers, 2 aircraft carriers, and dozens of troop transport and landing dock ships push off from their rally point a few miles off the Chinese coast. Their destination? Taiwan, and a forceful reunification of the breakaway country. Beneath the waves, an American Sea-Wolf submarine sits and observes the situation, relaying a burst transmission to the rest of the American military via extreme low-frequency communications. It's a Cold War relic, but still the quietest submarine in the world, and the Chinese subs hunting for American interceptors are much noisier than it. The burst transmission alerts the Chinese to its presence, but resting near the bottom of the Taiwanese Strait, the submarine is virtually invisible. The invasion warning reaches the top echelons of the U.S. military within minutes. American President Joe Biden made it clear within months of taking office that he would defend the Taiwanese people and their democracy with military force if necessary. The Chinese invasion fleet has taken weeks to amass, and the U.S. has had plenty of opportunity to make its own preparations. Spread out across the Pacific are 3 American carrier strike groups, each made up of just under 100 combat aircraft and escort vessels for the big carriers. On Guam, American bombers, drones, and fighter aircraft have been pre-positioned inside hardened bunkers, and U.S. aircraft across South Korea, Japan, and the greater southeastern Pacific have long been on alert. But just as word is reaching the Oval Office that the Chinese are initiating their invasion of Taiwan, the United States is the first to come under attack. The United States and China both wield considerable counterforce power, and both know that the stakes for not striking first could mean a knockout blow before the war even begins. The U.S. has prepared as best it could by moving aircraft into hardened facilities and dispersing its naval forces. But with an arsenal of hundreds of long and intermediate-range missiles, the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force is the first to draw blood. 200 ballistic missiles rain down on American military installations in Japan, the Philippines, and Thailand. The strike has come as a complete surprise. Chinese anti-satellite weapons have blinded or hacked American recon satellites in orbit meant to detect the thermal plumes of missile launches. Some of the missiles are aimed at specific targets, such as radar and communications hubs, while others disperse cratering munitions to knock runways out of operations. Yet others shower down smaller warheads across a wide area, destroying or seriously damaging hundreds of American and Japanese aircraft. This bolt out of the blue is a modern-day Pearl Harbor, and it's only just begun. Next, the PLARF's intermediate-range ballistic missiles begin to rain down on American ships across the South Pacific. 2 of the American carrier groups are in range of the strike, and despite a robust defense by Fleet Ballistic Missile Defense Systems, 1 carrier takes 2 direct hits and is sunk. 5,500 American sailors are killed in a matter of seconds, the fastest mass loss of life in U.S. military history. A second carrier survives the barrage, but is seriously damaged and considered a mission kill. Along with the loss of a dozen escort vessels, the United States has suffered the worst defeat in its military history and a financial loss of over $20 billion. Redundant systems mitigate the effects of Chinese anti-satellite attacks within minutes, allowing the United States military to get a clearer picture of the final phase of the ballistic missile Pearl Harbor it's currently enduring. The third wave of attacks come from China's 100 or so long-range ballistic missiles, which are targeted at bases in Australia, Guam, the U.S. and most important Pacific base, and Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. The advance warning of a few minutes allows a few alert aircraft to scream into the sky before they're destroyed on their paths, and the U.S. missile defenses throw up a cloud of steel attempting to defend the most important American military installations in the world. But stopping a fire truck-sized missile traveling many times the speed of sound is extremely difficult, and no nation in the world has ever mastered ballistic missile defenses. Runways, fuel depots, ammunition storage, and troop barracks are destroyed in seconds, with an additional 15,000 American airmen, sailors, and Marines dying in the attacks. It's 45 minutes into World War III, and China has already expended half of its missile forces. It will hold the rest in reserve to threaten American vessels and make sure its invasion of Taiwan goes unopposed by the U.S. There's more at stake here than one island democracy, though. The very fate of the world in the 21st century hangs in the balance. A military defeat of the United States signals a new top dog on the world stage, and China is very eager to shape the world in its own authoritarian image. Chinese fighters based on artificial islands that the country has been illegally building in the South Pacific for over a decade ensure air dominance across the most vulnerable approaches of the invasion fleet. With 2 carriers out of the fight and dozens of long-range air defense missile batteries spread out across China's unsinkable island aircraft carriers, American air power can't hope to threaten the Chinese Navy from the south. The attack on Taiwan is only vulnerable from the north, but the thorough destruction on joint American and Japanese military bases has forced the 2 nations to base their surviving air forces from civilian airfields. These too come under sporadic attack. Though Japan's missile defense forces do a fair job of shooting down the older generation missiles China has left in its inventory, China may have launched attacks on Japanese soil, but it has purposefully avoided sending troops to disputed Senkaku Islands. This was a calculated move, as Japan still has a strong pacifist streak. The attacks on its military installations anger many Japanese, but the savagery of the great missile attack in history has intimidated much of the Japanese people. If China is able to so thoroughly decimate the nation's military airfields, what could it do against its population centers? It's textbook American shock and awe, only this time used against its own friends. The Japanese Prime Minister meets with his cabinet to make an important decision. Will Japan join the US in its war against China? While the US is treaty-bound to defend Japan in case of attacks, the reverse is not true, and the situation looks grim. Much of US firepower in the Pacific has either been destroyed or seriously degraded. Diego Garcia and Guam are out of commission, leaving the US with few staging areas for an offensive against China. The loss of two of its carrier strike groups have reduced American firepower in the region by as much as 30%. Even with reinforcements from Central and European Command, there's simply few places the United States can stage a counterstrike against the Chinese from. And China still has hundreds of medium-range missiles, along with over 1,000 short-range ones. Japan has made its decision. It will not join the US in its fight against China. Further, to avoid an expansion of missile strikes on its own shores, Japan forbids the US from launching combat operations from airfields on its sovereign soil. American installations on Japan may be used for humanitarian purposes, but American combat aircraft cannot fly from the island nation to strike at Chinese forces. The loss of Japanese support is crippling for America's ability to fight the Chinese. While the US has encircled China with military installations, China has countered the US presence with a network of anti-air and anti-ship defenses, known as Anti-Access Area Denial or A2AD. The network's Chinese defenses have made it extremely hazardous for American ships or aircraft to come within hundreds of miles of Chinese forces. The US is not completely helpless though, and American submarine forces devastate the Chinese Navy over the coming days. China's anti-submarine warfare capabilities are severely lacking, and US subs are deadly quiet. However, losses mount over time, and with no surface vessels to exploit the losses inflicted by US submarines, the effort fails to turn the tide of the invasion of Taiwan. Chinese invasion forces are further devastated by American standoff attack weapons launched from a variety of long-range aircraft. A flurry of anti-ship and ground strike missiles pound Chinese forces, inflicting great losses. However, Taiwan is less than a day from a heavily militarized Chinese coast, and replenishing even the grievous losses incurred by the invasion is relatively simple without the US surface navy to threaten the effort. International outrage against China burns red hot, but the nation is much of the world's greatest trading partner. With 1.4 billion potential customers, corporations from around the world have made gaining access to Chinese markets a top priority for decades. Now, the massive economic clout wielded by China helps deflect much of the world's anger. While many condemn China for its invasion, nobody but the UK and Australia are willing to back up their words with military action. However, without the US Navy's support, there is little that even a joint fleet can do to break through the tough Chinese defenses in the South Pacific. The US may have been knocked out of the Pacific, but it is by no means defeated. Over the coming weeks, the largest naval battle group in American history is assembled off the coast of California, pulling together vessels from across American global commands. It's a concentration of firepower unseen in world history, and while losses will be extraordinarily high in the face of the Chinese A2AD defenses, the fleet is determined to break into the first island chain and to try to relieve the pressure on Taiwan. By now, though, Chinese forces have occupied much of the small island nation. The Taiwanese have put up a fierce defense of their island, and Chinese losses have been astronomical. Without U.S. naval and air power to seriously threaten the invasion forces' replenishment and resupply operations, though, the unending tidal wave of manpower from mainland China has overwhelmed Taiwan's defenders. The resistance is falling back to the central mountains, where heavy cover gives some protection from China's complete air superiority. Most of Taiwan's heavy equipment, including tanks, field artillery, and attack helicopters, has been destroyed by now. And while a guerrilla resistance could rage for years, China is in effect in control of the island. Hunted down by Chinese special forces, the Taiwanese president is forced to concede and accepts China's reunification of the island. Without U.S. support, there is no point in continuing the bloodshed. Over 100,000 Taiwanese have been killed or seriously injured, inflicting 4 times that number of the Chinese invaders. But defeat is inevitable, and under threat of more violence from China, the Taiwanese president surrenders. The United States is shocked by the sudden surrender. China has now completely secured the first island chain past its naval borders, and it quickly turns Taiwan into an island fortress. The American attack will now have to break through even tougher defenses than before, but the death blow to the U.S. war plans comes with Taiwan's official surrender. Whatever international support the U.S. had going into the war, it has quickly lost. The matter of Taiwan has been officially and violently resolved, and nobody feels like joining the U.S. in the massive loss of life it will take to restore Taiwanese independence, especially not with the equally massive hit to global trade that will come from full-scale war between the U.S. and China. China quickly sues for peace between itself and the U.S. The two nations are not evenly matched in terms of military power. While China maintains an advantage in the Pacific, the U.S. military still outmatches its own. The longer the war goes on, the greater the disparity in losses will be between the two powers, with China inevitably suffering a complete military defeat. The U.S. not only has the superior forces, but also the superior tactical position, as it's able to shut down almost all of Chinese overseas trade, which means a massive reduction in Chinese GDP, as high as 35%. It is in China's best interest to end the war quickly, and with the reunification of Taiwan and world opinion turning against further violence, the U.S. is forced to accept the ceasefire. The overwhelming bolt-out-of-the-blue attack on U.S. forces in the Pacific, the loss of the Japanese support, and the swift surrender of Taiwan have all worked to strategically defeat the United States. It has not suffered a military defeat, but in the end, China has accomplished all of its strategic goals in the region, and the world now knows that Asia and the Pacific, the most economically important region in the world, belongs to it. The United States had just lost the third and shortest of world wars, a defeat that